It's a Yukon podcast. I'm Professor Stephen Dyson.
And I'm Professor Jeff Dudas.
And Jeff, we are here today to talk about Ex Machina, the 2014 film written and directed by Alicia Garland. It's a film that I think we've both seen a few times in the past, and we just rewatched it, quite recently. Science fiction film, near-future science fiction film within the subgenre of kind of AI, robot rebellion type thing. We are going to dive deep into this film. We do address popular cultural texts on three levels: a kind of surface or textual level, where we talk about what the creator of the film, in this case Alicia Garland, who, as I said, wrote and directed the film, meant to put on screen, and also some of the explicit references that are made within the text. A second level we dive into, which we call mythologies, which we think of as things that the audience will either need to or just will bring to the text in order to kind of set it in context and kind of understand it. And then a third level, Jeff, critique, which
points us to the issue of learned interpretations of the text. How do learned watchers and audiences, what might they make of the text? So sometimes we'll talk about the way in which the text was in fact received. So other times we'll talk about sort of deeper, sometimes more normative questions about what the text might be trying to say or how it might generate particular kinds of reflections in us.
Yeah, and I have a hot take for that section, a sizzling hot take.
I can't wait.
I might need you to talk me down from this hot take, or sand the rough edges of it. We'll see how it goes. All right, should we get into it?
Let's go.
Okay, so talking about this text on the surface, as I said, genre near future, science fiction, AI creation, AI rebellion. One useful thing sometimes at this level is to set this movie in comparison with other movies that are in its past, either distant or recent. So AI creation films and AI rebellion films, you're talking things like 2001, in which you do, sort of an original AI rebellion film. The AI in that case, HAL 9000, disembodied, just a voice. You'd be talking about things like the Terminator, very clearly an embodied AI, embodied in Arnold Schwarzenegger, who the cultural critic Clive James referred to as looking like a condom stuffed with walnut. Maybe we'll cut that bit. Can we leave that in?
Sure.
That was what Clive James said. He's a legit cultural.
Say it.
Yeah, he's a legit cultural critic. But once you hear that metaphor, it's kind of hard to unsee.
We report and the audience
and
decides.
you decide. So clearly Arnie's body is sort of absolutely critical to what's going on in that AI rebellion story. It's a story about, the brute force of the Terminator, a very different rebellion than HAL 9000's rebellion in 2001. Am I missing other comparison shits there?
Well, Blade Runner is an obvious one with the embodied AI. In the comic book world, Brainiac, the character from Superman, who sort of takes over Krypton in its dying moments and, for all sorts of nefarious and evil purposes, would be an analog as well, a disembodied character there, like a HAL.
And the nature, Blade Runner is a really good comparison point because the nature of the body sort of matters. So quite famously in Philip K. Dick's novel, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, the replicants are not called replicants, they're explicitly called androids. And as I remember, I hope I'm not making a horrible ricket here, but if you open them up, they don't look biological, right? They sort of appear mechanical. I think I'm remembering that right in the
I'm not sure.
They're definitely called androids. And what happens in Ridley Scott's movie adaptation, Blade Runner, is they're not called androids, they're called replicants. And they very definitely, when you open them up, don't appear mechanical, right? They're organic artificial intelligences rather than mechanical artificial intelligences, which does sort of matter when you're thinking about what Ex Machina is trying to achieve. Because on one level, Ava is Alicia Vikander, right? It's her face, and certainly towards the end of the movie, it's her body as well. Yeah. But for most of the movie, we're shown this juxtaposition of an android and a biological being. In the parts of her body are kind of covered in skin, and there's no special effects being applied, right? It's just the actor. They're meant to appear completely human. And other parts of the body are deliberately left exposed, and they do have the kind of android servos and wires and all the rest of it.
Right. It's a little bit of a hybrid characterization of the AI.
Right.
The other text, which has become sort of near and dear, at least to my heart lately, and maybe to yours as well, would be the Rossum's Universal Robots from the early 1920s, which is a kind of in a lot of ways, is sort of a forerunner in popular culture, or at least popular storytelling, of the robot
Yeah, of every movie we just mentioned, it has, they kind of all have their, their roots in Rossum's Universal Robots.
And viewers and listeners, of course, can go back and do a deep dive on our earlier pod on Rossum's Universal Robots.
Yeah, and in Rossum's Universal Robots, they were artificial people. They were biological, right? They were created biological beings, which is in some sense you might think is not significant. There's the artificial versus quote unquote natural dichotomy still holds true. In other senses, does really matter.
Yeah.
Largely in how the humans are going to react to it.
And the other analog here is that the robots in Rossum's Universal Robots are made out of a kind of organic goo, and in Ex Machina, we get Nathan's sort of presentation to a puzzled Caleb of hardware and software that's encased within this kind of flexible gel. And the movie makes a big deal out of like the tactile nature, right, of this creation.
Yes.
And so there are plenty of analogs here for this movie.
So another thing we do in text is just orient people as to what's going on.
Yeah.
You mentioned some names there, or we've both mentioned names there. There's Ava, who is a artificial person or android that's being built at a secret facility that's also the sort of palatial home of tech-mogul Nathan.
Yeah. So let's pause on this for a moment, right? The scene, right? The context in which this takes place. So we are immediately presented with this, as you say, it's this literally glacial estate, and
it's a real place. It's
apparently in Norway. So all of our scenery is in Norway, but it's a very small little residence that's kind of out in the middle of this, what we're led to believe is this enormous estate. And there's only only Nathan is there. Very few people go there. Even when visitors come, the helicopter pilot is not allowed to come near the estate to the residence. Ava, right, which is not that far from Eve, right? It's an anagram in the same way that Eve is an anagram. And then we've got all kinds of allusions to the creation of gods, right, including the title.
Yeah.
Of the movie, which is Ex Machina, is a reference to the De Ex Machina, the sort of the Latin trope or literary device for storytelling. And so there is a kind of, it seems like there's a kind of a Christian origin story gone wrong that's sort of embedded and might work as background.
So all of these movies are going to have, I mean, in a sense, this is mythologies, but it's fine to allude to it here because you brought it up explicitly. Society is always going to process the creation of something that seems like life through these religious backdrops, because that's the original mythology that gives us the religions, right? It's like where the ultimate question, like where did we come from? And if you start creating things that are like us in some way, are you usurping or adopting the pose of the god? And indeed, that's an explicit exchange that's had between Nathan, who I mentioned is this kind of tech mogul who's doing his research in his secret facility, and Caleb, who is
an employee.
Yep. In Nathan's company,
yes,
who it seems randomly, although we later find out not so randomly, is selected as like a prize winner. And the prize is you get to go and hang out with Nathan in his on his estate.
For a week.
For a week, yeah.
But with what appears to be no sort of advanced notice about why it is that you're going there.
It's just like,
it would be good. Genius.
Yeah, don't you want to hang out with? And obviously Nathan is like supposed to be a Zuckerberg analog or an Elon Musk or one of those.
Well, which is clearly part of the appeal.
Yeah. Yeah, you
winning this
see behind the curtain and go hang out with Nathan, who is the boss of Blue Book. And I think it is significant that Blue Book, of course, sounds like Facebook, is an internet search engine. That it turns out Nathan has designed kind of, I think, that certainly the core algorithms for kind of Zuckerberg style. Yeah. And Nathan has been using to sort of data mine the world.
Blue Book is also something else in our context. It is a Blue Book is a little notebook that is blank that, famously college students will take essay exams, write their essay exams in. When Nathan corrects Caleb about the nature of, what do you learn from a search engine, right? What would be the data mining that one should engage in if you own a search engine and operate a search engine? And Nathan says to Caleb, all the other search engine moguls, they all think, all the other data miners who are stealing everybody's data and selling it, they all think it's about this. These searches reveal what people are thinking, right? And that their goal is to use all of this data in order to sell product.
Right.
But what a search engine actually does is it shows you how you're thinking. It shows how people are thinking. Well, that is sort of exactly what a blue book and a college essay scenario does. It asks students to show how they are thinking about the material. Embedded in that, of course, is a bit of what are they thinking as well. So there are multiple layers of meaning, it seems, to me anyway, with the phrase blue book. And then there's the third as well, which is explicitly mentioned in the text, which is that this is a reference to Wittgenstein, the philosopher of linguistics.
Who wrote blue books? Or?
Who used to refer to the notes that he would write as blue book.
Okay. I haven't much. I mean, I think I'm going to save it for my hot take in mythologies. But I have. And sorry,
there's another more profane.
That's why my mind went in the other direction, because I think it fits in with actually how I see this movie. But I'll hold on. Mm-hmm. Don't let me forget about that. We'll come back to that. Yeah, Nathan at one point says, the search engine was like striking oil in a world that hadn't invented internal combustion. And this is Nathan's great advance, is to understand that it's about what people are thinking, not just what they're how they're thinking, not what they're searching for. Which brings me to another of this kind of explicitly textual references that are made, or intertextual references that are made, which are between the creation of artificial intelligence and other technological advances humanity has made. So there's one. Right, the development of the internal combustion engine, which has, depending on your kind of climate politics, that same kind of double-sided valence, right? It's that artificial intelligence has. There are people who think this is a tremendous, route towards increased productivity and companionship and happiness and just advances, and we can use AI to cure disease and do millions of other things. There are other people, Nick Bostrom, the kind of philosopher of AI risk, being the most famous of them, who think it's essentially the end of humanity, right? We're engineering our own obsolescence, and we're going to go the way of the dinosaurs. In the same way, the combustion engine obviously does wonderful things, but also does terrible things has done bad things to the climate. The other reference along these lines is the reference to nuclear creation, which also comes up not
multiple times.
Yeah, and quite often in these kind of AI texts. The orchestral maneuvers in the Dark song, Enola Gay, is playing in the background, which you might miss if you're not of a certain age. But the Enola Gay, of course, being the American bomber that carries the first atomic bomb to bomb Japan. And, Enola Gay, you never should have taken off today, and the orchestral maneuvers in the Dark song. And also the other reference to atomic creation that goes on is, at one point, Caleb quotes Oppenheimer?
I am become death.
Yeah, I am become death, the destroyer of worlds, thinking that actually Nathan won't know what it is. And Nathan's like, I'm not an idiot, bro. Like, I know what that is. But, clearly Nathan is the Oppenheimer figure in this.
Yeah, and I think we've seen this a lot. The reference to nuclear power and the creation of nuclear power and the way that it gets out of the hands of its creators and becomes this weapon of mass destruction tends to be the obvious real-world analog that is almost always cited in these texts. We see it over and over and over again. These allusions to our real-world history of creating nuclear power, which shares the same kinds of potentials and downfalls as you say, the combustion engine and these other kinds of massive technological leaps and marvels of modern engineering. And so it's not surprising that we see encoded in this story also, which is, as you say, it's a story about I'm not sure it's a story about the promises of AI. It's certainly a story about the perils of AI. It's not surprising that we see explicit references to nuclear power.
Yeah, and it's an interesting moment, or an interesting comparison at this moment in AI creation, because one of the things that happened around the creation of atomic power, the atomic moment, was, of course, the Manhattan Project was where it was all happening. And this was introduced to the world in the form of a weapon, and quite deliberately as a shocking demonstration to achieve an immediate goal, which is to end the Second World War and kind of jockey for power in the Cold War, blah, blah, blah. Which means that nuclear matter or nuclear power has always had that negative halo of the destructive side attached to it. The counterfactual world would be, if this is presented to the world as a source of clean, cheap, renewable energy, how would we now be feeling about nuclear matters? And also, what would our climate look like? And so that kind of, there were a lot of utopians in the original atomic scientists who were weaponizing this product in service of an immediate goal, but they were profoundly conflicted about it. And they did hope that what atomic energy would bring was kind of H.G. Wells' dream of a kind of global society super powered with clean, free, cheap energy and kind of futuristic lives for everyone. And we talk a lot about AI risk and the risk of the alignment problem and runaway AI. It is worth remembering that to the extent nuclear energy, the nuclear creation moment is a clear analog. Are we going to run a similar risk, right? Which is we endow AI with fears and dangers. And do we, in that sense, then miss out on what could be revolutionary positive potentials? I mean, the nuclear moment would give us that lesson.
Well, if our storytelling is any indication, our clear preference is to invest AI with peril rather than promise.
Absolutely.
And, it starts, again, as we've been talking about, a long time in our history, in our storytelling history, of imagining human creations that then come to take on a sort of will or momentum of their own and come back to kill us in one way or another, or dominate us. Ex Machina fits very clearly into that very long and old human storytelling tradition.
Absolutely.
So they arrive. Let's get back to the narrative. Caleb arrives, and for his 1 week with Nathan, and Nathan immediately shows him his creation, Ava.
Right. And he explains to Caleb that you're not just here to kind of hang out with me, lift weights and drinks beer, which it seems that Nathan does three things, right? One is he creates, artificial intelligence. The other is he drinks beer. The third is in kind of punishment of himself. The morning after drinking a load of beer, he then, lifts weights. He's a very bro-y kind of individual.
Yeah, hits a heavy bag.
Yes.
In fact, we're introduced to him when he's pounding on a heavy bag like a boxer.
Yeah, and I have to say, and in fairness to Oscar Isaac and his portrayal of Nathan, he gets him sort of dead on, I think. Yeah. He's a very convincing, genius on one level, but sort of impoverished individual on another level. And just down to minor details, like, Nathan has a gut. And also quite a well-developed upper body. And if you did that exercise regimen and drank that much beer, you would have that body, right? So you actually get, there's a lot of method in the portrayal.
It's worth noting, I think, here at the outset that our main actors in this narrative are excellent.
Yeah, they're all great.
Oscar Isaac is one of the premier
they're all great
young actors.
And you're right, we should set the plot in motion, and I really do want to, but you've raised an important point, which is to do with the kind of staging of the text here. This is Alex Garland's first directorial feature. It's much less visually flashy than other AI narratives, I think. Blade Runner being the most obvious example, certainly 2001. It's much more, here are my actors, I'm going to point a camera at them and let them talk. Yeah. And it reminded me, both in that directorial choice, but also in the fact that it's kind of essentially a three-hander, and how talky it is and how unvisual it is. It's a stage play. Yeah. Right? That's what it seems most like. It seems like Ex Machina could be, with relatively few scriptural revisions, put on stage with three main actors, and you would get the point. It would work well.
I think that's right. And underscoring that point even further is that for a sci-fi movie, its most spectacular visuals are purely natural.
Yeah.
They are the landscape visuals that are provided by Norway.
Right, exactly. Which are in the movie, I think, just to illustrate Nathan's opulence. That he can afford to own this amazing piece of real estate.
But even there's the scene when they are sort of out, when Caleb and Nathan are out kind of exploring the grounds, I suppose, and they come across these just spectacular waterfalls and glacial runs that might seem out of place in a story that's supposed to be about high-tech stuff. Yeah. That, in fact, the touchstones are constantly the natural world.
Yeah.
And in fact, it is the natural world that so pulls and attracts Ava's will and attention.
That's true. And the contrast, of course, being to Blade Runner, where the whole point of the story is the creation of this totally immersive, but yet entirely artificial kind of reality, because what humans have done is they've essentially, in addition to creating new life, they've also destroyed the natural abundance of the earth.
And it's also a measure, it seems to me, of what you referred to as Nathan's sort of impoverishment of temperament and character, that he has created what is essentially a bunker in the middle of this spectacular setting, which, Caleb, when he first arrives and is put in this room, notices and is put off by. Like, where are the windows? Like, I mean, I'm in the most spectacular natural space that maybe anyone has ever seen. And you've got everybody holed up in this little bunker that's underground and that is cloistered and claustrophobic.
Yeah, Nathan's just watching his creations on video screens the whole time. Yes, that's a smart point about the visual design that I hadn't quite picked up at. Okay, I think we should get into what Nathan is doing what Caleb is doing at Shea Nathan, but we do need to take just a quick break here. And we are back. We're continuing our discussion of Ex Machina, and we're talking about the things that the author of the text has kind of put on the surface of the text in our kind of first assay into trying to understand this text. One thing, Jeff, that is referred to explicitly and repeatedly is the Turing test. And this is often seen as like the tagline, like it's a Turing test movie. Turing test named, of course, after the British mathematician Alan Turing, whose famous paper in 1950, Computing Machinery and Intelligence, elaborated a way to think about the question of whether machines are thinking, or more precisely what he said is that's a stupid question. What you really need to test is can a hidden machine, via its responses, to questions that are posed to it over the medium of text, convince someone who cannot see the machine that it's actually a human. So very famously, a test not of machine thinking, but of a machine's ability through written answers to deceive a human into thinking they're talking to another person. So that's what the Turing test is. It's often misremembered as being about other things in a way that I think is salient to this movie, Jeff, because Nathan tells Caleb pretty early on, you're here to be part of a Turing test. He says, you're the human component in a Turing test. He then elaborates at various points in the movie on what precisely the Turing test is. Because instantly, this is not the Turing test as Turing designed it, because Ava is not hidden from Caleb. Ava is presented to him as an artificial intelligence. And not only is he told this is an artificial intelligence, this is not Deckard being told Rachel is an artificial intelligence when Rachel is indistinguishable from a person. Ava has great parts of her body missing or exposed, so you can see and are constantly reminded as viewers and as Caleb, this is an artificial intelligence. I counted at least 4 evolutions of the Turing test during the movie. And I want to see if you agree with me and what we can make of this. So first of all, there's the initial evocation. Nathan tells Caleb, you're the human component in a Turing test. Later in the movie, Nathan says to Caleb, the real test is to show you she's a robot and see if you still feel that she has consciousness.
And this is his reaction to Caleb's objection that, in fact, he's not involved in a Turing test precisely because of the point you just made. He can see Eva. He knows that this is an AI that he's
right.
with.
And so yes, this is a deeper and more advanced Turing test, right? It's not the ChatGPT test. Can you give me a plausible answer in natural language to an inquiry that I pose? It's, do I actually think there's some sentience behind what's going on? I've even put parentheses, that's a test of Caleb, not Ava. Is that a stupid point, or is that reasonable? I suppose it's a test of Ava's ability to deceive Caleb.
Yes.
But you'd imagine also there's 2 variables there, right? There's Ava's ability to convince a human, then there's the human's susceptibility to being convinced. I suppose that was always true in any Turing test. Some humans are going to be better at perceiving, are going to be more likely to perceive the Turing test one way or another. Okay. 3. The test at some point becomes whether Ava likes Caleb or not, which is a totally different thing.
I think it's at least presented by Nathan as a subset of the previous question of Ava's consciousness.
So for her to authentically like him, she would have to have consciousness.
This would be the measure of her consciousness, yes.
Okay, all right.
Or I should say it would be the measure of Caleb's belief in Ava's consciousness.
Yeah, okay. But that is yes. That again is either a higher or at least a more specific version of a Turing test. And I know in mythologies we're going to talk about gender. Anyway, let's put a pin in that and come back to why it's then important that she's portrayed as a female robot and he's portrayed as a male identifying person. 4, Nathan later tells Caleb the true test of Ava was whether she would successfully manipulate Caleb in order to escape and would show not just intelligence, but also kind of a will toward autonomy.
Yeah, so I actually think that that fourth point returns us to the original, at least the core element of the Turing, what we understand to be the Turing test, which is the question of deception.
Okay.
Because in the end, it is a Turing test. It's a measure of whether the human, in this case Caleb, can be in fact deceived and manipulated by an AI in a way that Nathan clearly believes is human-like in character. The capacity to realize desires, autonomous goals, and a kind of independent will through manipulation and deception. I think, these stories, these AI stories are always stories, as we've talked about in other pods, about the lines of demarcation between the human and the non-human. And I think it's fair for us to conclude sort of at the end of this four-part instantiation of the Turing test that this is how Nathan conceives of the core nature of humanity, the capacity to manipulate and deceive other beings in the service of accomplishing your goals and desires.
Okay. So
this is what makes something human, essentially, I think, is what we're led to believe.
Yeah.
And so this is the test. Can this AI do that to another being?
Okay, I want to make one point, and then I want to ask you a question. So first, in terms of the illusions that the movie's making, the intertextual comparisons, that's a very interesting one, given that Facebook, Blue Book, is the kind of corporate thing that's lying in the background here, because Facebook comes to us as a global public square, right? That's its on the surface thing, right? What has, critics would argue, its actual effect being? It's being to kind of manipulate and kind of alter, not give the ability for people to express themselves and the great kind of grassroots democratic movement, but actually part of an information ecosystem that algorithmically is distorting people's understanding of reality and is allowing misinformation to dominate sometimes over information. So that's a very interesting, that's the extension of that argument about our information environment into or its projection onto the kind of traditional AI story. So the question I want to put to you is, what you've given me there is a sort of evolution of the way the Turing test is being presented that makes it seem very consistent, right? That actually the 4 iterations that are given in the movie are just more precise iterations of an internally consistent Turing test. That would be the view that gives a lot of credit to Alex Garland as a screenwriter and a lot of credit to this movie. The negative view, and I want to know whether you do want to give that credit or adopt the negative view. The negative view is actually the nature of the test is changed throughout the movie to serve plot purposes, or is sort of somewhat confused, or is a way to artificially generate suspense, which is necessary in the movie. Because if you said at the start what the test really is, I suppose you're giving away the end of the movie. Where do you come down on that? Or is that really a...
Two things can be true.
Okay. It works dramatically, and also is Alex Garland is constantly in control of what's going on.
Yeah, I think that the narrative of consistent iterations from our more conventional Turing test to what it is that Nathan eventually confesses, I think that that's plausible in the way that the story is told. And I think it's consistent with what we know about Nathan as a character.
Yeah.
That this is somebody who clearly believes in the manipulation of people, of things, of data for his own purposes.
Right.
That this appears to be what he takes as his sort of modus operandi in the world. This is what he's good at. This is what he thinks is essential to at least his life, although I think we come to find out it's not a meaningful life, right? So I think that there's a way of reading it that is internally consistent.
Yeah, okay. So it's if it's deceptively presented to the audience, that's because Nathan is a deceptive character, and the deception is actually on. Caleb is supposed to represent us in this story, right? He's the kind of well-intentioned every man who's discovering this situation, and he's been lied to by Nathan, so it's okay for the movie to essentially sort of lie to us about what the nature of the test is. Okay, that's really, really interesting. I wanted to move, maybe past the Turing test and ask you this, Jeff, because I'm confused about it. Which is, what is Ava for? What is Nathan's motivation? If you think of other AIs in the movies we talked about, HAL 9000 is some supercomputer to help fly a spaceship. Clearly his abilities are necessary. He allows the crew to go to sleep and survive on the journey, and he controls all the ship's functions. We know what that AI was created for. It's for that task. The Terminator, we know what Arnie is for and the later iterations, right? They're the agents of a runaway AI to try and change history. They're assassins, I suppose, was a simple way to say that. We know what the AI is for. They're supposed to be like super assistants that help people and, maybe provide a bit of companionship along the way. Blade Runner, the replicants are, slaves, right? They're labor, pleasure models, they're supposed to serve humanity in a sort of property. But what is Ava supposed to be doing, right? She's not, he doesn't describe her as someone who's going to go off and kind of dig ditches or do menial tasks. She's not described as a personal assistant, right? She doesn't seem to have that. She's not, her capacities are in appearing human, right? She's not portrayed as especially super intelligent, right? He is trying to engineer her to be as manipulative as a human, but she's not presented as a HAL 9000 kind of, or Data from Star Trek, like super competent, super intelligent person. He never in the movie, as far as I can tell, explicitly says, I am creating the AI to do this. He's just doing it, right? It's just something to do.
But I think there's one clue.
Okay.
He refers to himself as Ava's father.
Okay.
He does not refer to any of the other AI creations in that way.
Yeah.
I think he's trying to make himself.
Okay.
I think he's trying to reproduce his essential character, which he certainly believes to be someone who is capable of instrumentally manipulating others and the environments around him in order to realize his will and his desire. Okay. This is why he keeps working on the AIs, because we know eventually the question is not whether Ava has whether he can create an AI that has consciousness,
right,
or independent will, because he's already done that. Eventually, Caleb, when he kind of sort of gets his hands into the old records of what Nathan has been doing for presumably years previous, he finds that, in fact, there are lots of earlier models of AI who have independent consciousness and autonomous will. They, for a long time, for several models at least, Nathan has created an AI who desperately wants to escape from this kind of prison research facility in which they're housed. So that's already been done. What Ava is capable of doing, though, is trying to realize that capacity for autonomous will and desire through manipulative, instrumental means, not through brute force, not through kind of wild expressions of desire and emotion. But I think that's what we're meant to mean, that what we're meant to understand is that Nathan is trying to create himself, to recreate himself.
Okay, so then he would be one of these tech multi-billionaires who is probably a sort of post-humanist in some senses, and who has strange ideas about the future of the species, and sees themselves as more capable and more hard-headed in realizing this, kind of woolly-headed.
He's a narcissist.
Right.
And so when he looks at Ava, what he sees reflected back at him is his own essential character.
So in that case,
and he needs confirmation, though.
Right.
I think he needs confirmation from someone like Caleb that he has in fact succeeded.
Yes.
In doing this. He needs the kind of, slightly naive, but, good faith person to come in and just be completely and totally manipulated.
Right.
In order to convince him that he has in fact succeeded with Ava.
Yeah, and that's why he shows her she's a robot, right? Because it makes the test harder. It's a more difficult set of conditions under which to achieve a test. In which case, that puts an interesting spin on something that's always talked about in AI, which is the alignment problem, right? Which is the great fear that once you create very capable artificial intelligence, it will outstrip our ability to confine it or give it rules of operation, and will start kind of defining its own rules of operation and so forth. If that analysis is correct, and what Nathan was trying to do was actually create something who was as good, if not better than him, in the dark arts of manipulation, then Ava's escape out into the world is not actually an alignment failure. She in fact is entirely aligned with the goals of her creator and remains so. Yeah. The problem is the goals of her creator are profoundly anti-humanist.
Yes. And she is an incredible success story. And her escape, by the way, is an incredible success story with this line of thinking as well. And it's also worth noting that we get lots of evidence that Nathan has been helping to actively engineer this manipulation, Ava's manipulation of Caleb.
Right.
He knows it's been going on. He has done nothing to stop it. In fact, at multiple points, we see how he's encouraged it.
Yeah, and all this like Ava creates power cuts so they can be alone, but it's obvious Nathan knows,
knows what's happening.
Like so for him to be ignorant of that, he would have to be a person who's capable of single-handedly running the world's most advanced artificial intelligence research laboratory, in everything from basic theory to advanced manufacture on his own. Right? There's no one else there, but he also can't work a fuse box.
Yes, that's right.
That would be the two things that would need to be true.
Yes.
Okay, good. Anything else we want to say on the surface level?
I think we've covered it pretty comprehensive.
Excellent. So let's then move after a brief break to our second level, which is the level of societal mythologies. And we are back with part 2 of our analysis of the film Ex Machina. This is the section where we discuss mythologies that are necessary for understanding the text, by which we mean things that circulate within the culture. And of course, they're going to vary across the time and space. Different cultures might bring different mythologies to this understanding. We can really only speak for our own cultures, I think. But what sort of societal meaning structures are brought to the text that might help audiences to understand the text, or I suppose that might be deceiving to audiences in understanding the text, but they're going to bring them anyway, so we should discuss it.
Right. And these are things that tend to exist outside of the text itself, and certainly outside of the creator's or the author's will. Now, frequently it's the case, we'll see that an author of a text will seem to throw some reference to some of these deeper cultural themes.
Yeah.
But that's not really our concern, right? We're less interested in the goals here of the author, the intended goals of the author, and more in the, as you say, the sorts of experiences and background understandings that an audience would be likely to bring with them to the experience of engaging the text.
Yes. So there are some literal mythologies. I mean, we tend to use the word quite loosely, but there are some literal in terms of very old or foundational myths of many societies that are always going to be implicated in this kind of text. Frankenstein, the original sort of creation
fiction
myth, which I think might be the most dead-on kind of mythology for this thing, single genius creator, creating thing that escapes their grasp and runs off into society rather famously, right? That's the Frankenstein thing is Dr. Frankenstein has to chase the creature all across the place. The Golem myth, the Pygmalion myth, because Ava's a sort of beautiful, the statue that's so beautiful that the creator falls in love with him. Maybe Pygmalion because it has that. It's a female artificial creation, and there is the element of falling in love with the creation. Prometheus.
There are a multitude of Native American origin stories, creation myths in which animals or sort of animal-human hybrids create human beings out of clay or straw or bits and pieces of the earth, with the explicit fear that those human beings will essentially ruin the world.
Yep.
There's a way, I think, there's the books of Genesis, I think, or the book of Genesis, those initial chapters, those Christian origin stories have an element of this creation of humanity that then goes out and befouls the world in one way or another. And the other myth that we just talked about in the previous section, the myth of Narcissus, right, is absolutely at work here, right? In which, you stare into the stream and see your face coming back, and it leads to their demise.
Yeah. Although you have to wonder, to finish a point we picked up about the alignment problem, you have to wonder how pissed off Nathan is really, if at all. I mean, wouldn't he have his kind of wry smile of satisfaction as the knife plunges in?
But I think he does. That's the meaning of his last couple of words, right? In which he sort of utters he utters Ava's name, but it's not out of bitterness or anger or disappointment.
Yeah.
It's almost like a kind of a tenderness.
Yeah, you're the one.
Yeah.
It turns out.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you're right. He was going to keep going because part of Caleb's motivation to try and rescue her is he tells her he's going to wipe her and start again if she doesn't pass this test. So he was going to keep doing it until she escaped, and he had to assume that escape was going to be kind of his demise. Caleb says to Nathan, if you've created a conscious machine, that's not the history of man, that's the history of gods. Clear allusion to kind of mythological ideas here. You raised an interesting point when we were discussing this movie off camera that Nathan misremembers this later and then says to Caleb, hey, bro, you remember when you called me a god?
Yes.
And Caleb's like, I didn't quite.
And it's not a throwaway scene either, because it turns into a kind of extended argument in which Nathan continues to insist that Caleb has called him a god. And on at least 3 separate occasions, Caleb's like, but I didn't say that. That's not what I said. So that confusion, again, it points us to, I think, Nathan's essential character here, which is to imagine himself, at the center of the universe, right? And that his goal is to recreate himself, to repopulate the universe with essentially himself.
Right. Yes, I think so. The history of man, and here I want to start talking about gender, which is something that often comes up in the mythologies section. And we always do, I think, Jeff, have a little bit of a limitation just by our own identities, in that we can only bring to this who we are as people. And we might, I suppose where I'm going with this is, we might fairly be accused of being within the same kind of closed circle of understanding that people sometimes accuse this movie of, which is this is a movie in which it's essentially a sort of philosophical battle between two men written by a man about a beautiful female robot, or a robot character played by a beautiful actress. I don't know what a beautiful actor. I don't know what would be the proper way to phrase that. And there's a lot of history behind those kind of things, and you get into the areas of kind of how women are portrayed on screen, how artificial women are portrayed on screen, the femme fatale, within the sci-fi genre, the kind of sex robot. If you've created a conscious machine, that's not the history of man, that's the history of gods. Do we allow that formulation as just that's the way that people would speak, especially about old-timey things, history of man and not the history of people? Do we think that's a deliberate... Do we think that's an area in which the writer has misstepped and is just using gendered language where it's not appropriate? Or do we think that Alex Garland, the writer, is fully aware of the misogyny of his characters and maybe his closed world, and is critiquing rather than just embodying or endorsing that?
Well, it's always hard to know, and this is a problem we frequently run across with our first category of analysis, on the surface textual analysis. It's always hard to know what exactly is in the mind and in the head of the author. And the nice thing about this category is that we essentially bypass that discussion and we focus upon the presentation of the themes and how they would be interpreted by an audience. I think Nathan is for sure a misogynist.
Right.
And I don't think the movie is coy or or mysterious about that at all.
Yeah.
This is a guy who has retreated, secluded himself into a bunker and has created either a series of domestic robots or sex robots.
Well, actually, they're the same thing, and they might be to a person of that mindset.
Servicing robots.
Yeah.
Or he's created Ava, whose, as we've talked about, whose sole purpose on Earth appears to be the capacity to manipulate men in particular into doing her bidding.
Right.
Which is, again, is this sort of femme fatale, very old and negative presentation, right, of women in storytelling. So the entire universe of Nathan's imagination of women appears to be confined within these very stereotypical, conventional, disempowering visions.
And it's Kyoko is the most egregious sort of example on this. A robot who he created without the capacity to speak. but she can dance. And as he crudely says, and I won't repeat it, she can also do something else. You know, and it just exists at this kind of fantasy.
She's a sex slave and a domestic worker,
Right,
basically.
exactly.
And not the only one, and certainly not the first one, because we see, you know, he's...
Yeah, and it's a procession of uniformly beautiful, you know, I mean, of different races and all the rest of it, but they're just kind of fantasy figures. You know, there's no men, there's no non-conventionally attractive women are portrayed here.
I think the more interesting discussion, and I think one is probably a different discussion that we have now at the end of 2024 than we may have had in 2014 when the movie was released, is the question of Caleb.
Yes.
Right? What are we to make of Caleb? Now, Caleb is a kind of tech bro himself, but a worker, not the leader of Blue Book. But he's represented as an engineer who has some coding talent. We know he's single. He doesn't appear to date. His physicality it's not unmasculine, but it's certainly not of the same kind of physicality that Nathan is. He's not shown with big bulging muscles.
Yeah, Nathan physically dominates him. He's kind of narrow-shouldered, skinny.
A little bit more circumspect in how he talks. Somebody who's, you know, and who Nathan specifically refers to as a good person. Yeah. So like the kind of the good guy who doesn't have any success in the dating world, right?
Well, I think for Nathan, he represents a kind of soft-headed, kind of bully, naive, probably a feminist, you know, self-identifies that way.
Sort of naive guy that, you know, and so I think there's a way in which audiences, particularly from 2014, might see Caleb as the kind of, you know, everyman good guy.
Yeah.
And someone who's unthreatening, right? And who does not forward who's not representative of a potentially disempowering or toxic form of masculinity. However, I think that's probably the typical way in which a lot of audiences, maybe almost all audiences, would have interpreted Nathan Caleb in 2014. But I think, you know, with the benefit of hindsight, historically and culturally, but also I think even within the movie itself, there are little bits and pieces of clues that maybe Caleb is not the kind of, you know, fully decent person, right, that the movie might have him off to be. I mean, after all, he is actively participating in a process by which he objectifies and degrades another being, right, who is represented as a female. Right. He goes along with it. He actively goes along with it. Mm-hmm. And he finds himself kind of happy to be a part of the process. Like, he is happy to be a voyeur, right? He's constantly gazing, right, at Ava from his room. He quickly gets obsessed with her in a kind of very creepy, sort of stalkerish way.
Yeah.
So it's all of this is I think a kind of a complicated or maybe too complicated way of sort of trying to get in at this question of whether the movie itself is misogynist or whether its characters are misogynist, and does it make a difference?
Yeah.
Nathan, I think, is definitely a misogynist.
Okay.
Caleb, I think, can be seen in that way as well.
So Caleb exists within he's a subordinate male to Nathan, right? He exists within that recognizable structure of masculinity, which, you know, is something like jock and nerd from high school.
Yeah.
Right. And Caleb's, but Caleb, I agree with you, can be read as harboring all these sort of simmering resentments about, you know, his sort of physical, material, intellectual inferiority to Nathan, his lack of apparent dating success, you know, and he's running his own scheme in which Ava is a pawn.
Yeah.
And I don't know what that says. Like you say, I think it's perhaps unanswerable whether that means the movie itself exists within a closed circle of masculinity with only masculine perspectives, some of which may appear more, on the surface more offensive than others, you know, and that's what's going on because the writer can't get outside of it, and maybe we as audience members can't. I mean, by which I mean me and you can't get outside of it, or it's a kind of wholesale critique of that by portraying how awful these things are. And I often think of you get a similar problem with Blade Runner, which both movies but particularly the first one, are often seen as having a problem, a quote unquote woman problem with the portrayal of women. And on the one hand, you say, yes, but it's a dystopia, right? Like, this is not being presented as a good society. And the screen direction for the original shot of Blade Runner was supposed to be Deckard coming into Los Angeles on a train, not the famous kind of flying in scene that you do see. And the screen direction was train enters hell, right? So they're thinking of this as hell, and hell is misogynistic, right? Which is not an endorsement of misogyny. It's an indictment of hell, you know. And does that let Blade Runner off for the same kind of behavior?
Yeah.
Or do you just say, well, but no, these are kind of voyeuristic portrayals of closed circles of masculinity? And I don't know the answer. Maybe we're the wrong people to answer it.
I don't know. And it's also, of course, worth noting that in the end, both of our male characters are punished, right? The role reversal results in Ava being the one who's free.
Sure.
And her male interlocutors, I suppose, being the ones who are either dead or who are confined and trapped in this research bunker.
Yeah. Which you can read two ways, right? You can read, hooray, the misogynists got what they deserved. Or you can read from probably what Nathan and certainly Caleb are thinking, which is, damn woman, did me in again. They're all manipulative, destructive forces.
Something that you noted earlier is I think, important. Caleb is not engaged in this scheme to free Ava for Ava's sake.
Right.
He's doing it because he has fallen in love with her and wants to be, and sees her as presumably as the answer to his dating problems.
Yes.
Right. And his companionship problems.
Yeah.
Right. So that also turns the screws against Caleb when it comes to the question of whether he's a good person.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So I want to use this next point to transition into critique, and I'll give you my hot take, which is one thing we've only alluded to is the sort of amount of female nudity in this film, which I think at the level of analysis we've operated at so far, for me anyway, would tip the scales into it being actually quite a misogynistic film, because you can make all of those intellectual or cultural points without displaying the female form in the voyeuristic ways that it's portrayed on screen, unless there's something deeper or more critical going on, right? That kind of male gaze, I suppose, would be the right term, needs to be justified, I think, by a broader critical point than the ones we've made so far in order to tip the balance of the movie away from misogyny. And I want to make a case or an argument for what that broader or more incisive critical point might be when we come back in a second. And we are back with our discussion of Ex Machina. We are in the home straight here, Jeff. We're talking about our third and deepest section, the section of critique, in which we try and understand some of what the movie is, I suppose, really getting at, some of its hidden depths, maybe try and understand some critical reactions to the movie, try and look at some of its normative questions, what forms of our lives, is it critiquing, is it forwarding a different or better form of life, or we try and just come up with a kind of against the grain reading that might give a fresh perspective on this movie. Okay, I actually have a take I want to try out on you with this movie, Jeff, and we haven't really discussed this before, and I'm not 100% confident in the take, so I'm willing to be argued off it.
Yeah, it's too late to stop now, though.
Too late to stop now. It's I've begun, so I'm definitely going to finish. On about the, I don't know, 6th or 7th time that I watched this movie, I sort of formed a theory of it that it's not really about what it purports to be about, that it's not really about artificial intelligence and the creation myth and that kind of thing. And all of this is sort of a smokescreen as to what the movie is really about. And what the movie is about is pornography and a pornographic sensibility. And that could be pornography, as in the literal sense, or I could mean it in the kind of male gaze or a kind of pornographic cinematic style as a critique that's often labeled at Hollywood in general or male filmmakers in particular. And I think there are a few clues and a few more than clues that are secreted throughout the movie. So first of all, I didn't mean to do that, but yes. First of all, at one point, Caleb says to Nathan, "Did you design Ava's face based upon my porn search?" And Nathan's already made the point that Blue Book is a search engine. And he says, what are search engines for, right? And if they're for searching out online pornography, which the throwaway line is, which is the purpose of the internet. So there's that. That's a pretty strong kind of hint. At one point, Ava says to Caleb, "Do you think about me when we are not together?" Which sounds like love, right? A definition of love. And then she follows that with, "Sometimes at night, I wonder if you are watching me on the cameras, and I hope that you are." Well, that's not love. That's voyeurism and pornography. And so the movie there, by putting those two lines together, seems to be about the conflation of the two things. And this is a movie in which male characters constantly watch women. Sometimes the women are aware of being watched. Sometimes they're not aware of being watched. Sometimes they're dressed. Sometimes they're undressed. Going about their activities, and in some senses performing for them, right? So it's a movie about webcam girls, for want of a better phrase. The scene that really pushed me over the edge into thinking this was a legitimate reading of the movie that at least we need to consider is quite late in the movie. There's a scene in which Caleb goes into a room, and there are sort of a set of doors to lockers, each one of which crucially I think has a mirror on it. So Caleb's kind of watching himself, and at each door he opens, there's a different naked woman behind it. And these are earlier iterations of Nathan's robots. They're of different ethnicities, slightly different body types, but all within the realm of very beautiful women. And so Nathan is kind of selecting a different porn video, a different fantasy figure, a different door to open. What is the process of online search? But it's just the sort of constant availability of overwhelmingly different types of fantasies that are available while you're kind of sitting looking at a screen, and maybe that's what the mirror is. It's kind of reflecting. Kyoko is naked on a couch for some reason, just watching him.
Right.
And at one point, and the other thing that I think is going on that's essentially pornographic is these are not presentations of sex workers. He's not going to have sex with them. They're not presentations of fully realized women. They're collections of body parts. Okay, so some of the women are not, are missing an arm, or and what is the pornographic experience or sensibility other than the reduction of a fully formed person to essentially limbs and skin, and to be consumed visually but not touched physically, and Kyoko's naked and kind of watching the naked women, and then she starts pulling bits of her own skin off, thus revealing she's not a real woman. She's also a kind of a visual avatar. And then finally, we alluded to this earlier in the movie, Blue Book, as the name of the search engine, may have that high-minded Wittgenstein element, but there's also blue balls,
yes,
right? Which is Caleb is chasing Eva for the whole movie,
right? And
she is as unattainable as the webcam girl, and in fact, she leaves him behind a screen and kind of walks out. He's never physically able to fulfill his desires with her, and so this is
and also not to cut you off, but there's also a potential reference here to comedians working blue.
Yes.
Which is that this is a collection of thoughts, of ideas, of themes that are registering in the realm of the profane.
Right. Yeah. So there would be that illusion as well. So yeah, this seems to be it's a movie about men watching beautiful women in states of undress who are portrayed as limbs and body parts of various kind of fantasy archetypes through screens.
But also,
what is that except a movie about pornography?
Body parts that are interchangeable.
Yeah.
Which we learn at the very end when Ava sort of herself finds herself in that room with all of the the lockers of sort of former models of AI.
Right.
And she just kind of picks and chooses different bits of flesh.
Yes.
Right. From the various models until she makes up herself and covers up all of her sort of cyborg components.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that is an interpretation that certainly seems more than plausible and would point us back, I think, into our previous discussion about the question of how is it that this movie wants to present the male gaze, right? Is it just that the characters are misogynist, or is the film itself essentially presenting a kind of from a posture of misogyny and from a posture of the male gaze? Is the film itself just a high-end version of, as you say, the pornographic sensibility?
Right. And what is the what is the film saying to the audience about why you're still watching this film, right? Are you really watching this film? Are we not all Caleb, right? In that we think we're high-minded and we're watching a high-minded Turing test film about the philosophical boundary between the real and the artificial. What we've actually seen on screen is naked women for a long period of time. Or combined with violence and,
Or is it that we imagine that we're Caleb, but we're actually Nathan?
Right. Yeah. So I suppose now I think of this doesn't actually solve the problem for us of how to read this movie as whether it's misogynistic or not, right? It clearly depends on what generosity you're willing to allow, or what degree of control you're willing to believe the writer has over the materials he's deploying.
Well, I think and not only that, but also how is it likely to be received by the audience, independent of the author's intent?
Yeah.
And I think it probably hinges upon what the audience makes of Caleb.
Yeah. Okay.
At the end of the day, does the audience interpret him as a well-meaning victim of all of this gone awry, who got in over his head and all he wanted was love, and he had done what appears to be the noble thing in trying to free the captive princess from her, from her captivity? Or do we see him as this kind of creepy, selfish, barely well-meaning person who actually is just trying to free Ava so that he can have his own sex bot?
Yeah. Like what would nowadays be called an incel?
Yeah.
You think it is very interesting. Yeah. I mean,
so I think it matters. It has to do with what the audience makes of what they're seeing.
Yeah.
And it does strike me from that perspective that Caleb is probably the essential character.
Yeah. Okay, so here's my view then at the end of this, which is I'm really glad we've talked about this movie. I definitely have, after this rewatch and after talking about it with you, I think I hold it in higher esteem than I did before, because I think I'd come to a view after the first few watches of this movie like it's a talky Turing test type of movie. It has some pretty unsavory kind of elements to it, and then I thought, well, I'm being very clever. It's actually about pornography and maybe that elevates it, and I think that would elevate it because it's something that's not immediately apparent. It's doing different work. I now find that I can't think my way out of this. I can't think my way beyond this dilemma or this ambiguity about what the movie is really saying about a critique of not just men but particular forms of masculinity, and whether it's on the quote right side or wrong side of that debate. I think it's unresolvable whether it is, or it's a very subjective question as to whether it is, and I can't resolve it in my own mind, which to me elevates the movie up into a tier of things that will constantly make you think every time you sort of rewatch it. So I think I have a higher appreciation of it now than I did.
Yeah, I think it's a good and interesting text.
Yeah.
And its ambiguity is exactly the reason why. It's ambivalence, I guess.
Yeah.
And it's really useful, I think, for us to have this kind of three-part approach again, because in the end, the ambivalence depends entirely upon the audience, it seems to me. And that points us outside of the meaning structure of the text itself. And it leads us to broader consideration of how it is that we, as historically embodied and culturally embodied persons, interpret the world and the stories around us.
Okay. All right, good. Is there anything else you would like to say about Alex Garland's 2014 Ex Machina?
No.
Okay, so I think we should leave it there. And on that bombshell,